So I invite you to read Hebrews for yourself as we're going through, as we're walking through it over the next few weeks. And some of you have taken me up on this, and you've said to me, "This is hard." And I agreed with you. This is hard. Actually, this week I thought to myself, "What in the world am I doing trying to walk through this book?" But off we go. So one thing that seems to be underlying this book is a feeling of theological embarrassment. It seems like this is likely one thing that's going on. That the people that are being written to are embarrassed to a certain extent about their Jesus. And the problem is that Jesus dies. That Jesus is Messiah, but he dies. Everybody out in the Roman world in the first century understands what a Savior is supposed to look like. A Savior looks like Caesar, up on a throne, powerful. Jews understand what a Messiah is supposed to look like David, on a throne, powerful. But this congregation and others are proclaiming that Jesus is Messiah, and Jesus died a tragic death. And that's okay for a while, but then things start to get bad, and as they start to face persecution, then you can see a situation where doubts would start to creep in, and people start wondering, well, is this really right? Are we on the right path here? And one of the problems that seems to be going on in the Hebrew, or in this congregation, is some people are moving their devotion from Jesus to the angels, because they understand why you would give devotion to angels. They don't die. They're up here, above humanity. But Jesus, I don't know. And I mention that because I think for us in our time, especially in the mainline church and among many who have left the church, we also have a sense of theological embarrassment. Some embarrassment about Jesus, or some embarrassment about this grand story of salvation that Hebrews will be putting forward. Because anytime we start talking directly about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, some of us get a little fidgety when we walk right into it. And there are questions that naturally come up, like, so why would God send his Son to die on the cross for the sins of the world? That just seems kind of brutal. Couldn't God think of another way to save the world? And isn't there another story that could be offered that's not quite so violent and bloody? I just don't know if I can give myself to this. These are very natural questions that come up, and I take them very seriously, and I must share honestly that they're among questions that I've had to resolve for myself. Now, over this week and the next few weeks, I don't promise to resolve any of those questions if you carry them. What I do hope to do, however, is to encourage us to imagine ourselves in the life of this congregation and to understand some of the logic that's behind this story and try to understand why this response of the writer would have been helpful for this particular situation. And hopefully through that, we'll be able to hear the meanings that this writer is sending to this congregation and to us as well. So as we move towards our passage from Hebrews, before I just share verse 10, I want us to imagine being in this congregation. You are that congregation that's being written to. So all of you have experienced persecution. All of you, as you're going about your daily lives, have been made fun of. People have been yelling at you, have been angry at you. Some people have thrown stones at you. 50% of you have been hit by a stone. Have you been walking through? And the reason is because you're doing something illegal. Okay? You're proclaiming that Jesus is Messiah and not Caesar. And that's bad for business. Because when you're causing trouble, then the Roman soldiers come in and they start poking around, and people don't like that. Okay? A third of you have gone to jail because you're committing treason, because you're following Jesus. A fourth of you have been tortured in jail. 5 of you thought you were going to die because you were beaten to the edge of your life. It took you 3 weeks to be nursed back to health. And all of you are wondering, when you leave this morning, if the Roman soldiers are going to be there, if they'll have figured out where you're meeting this Sunday, because they all told you not to come back, but you did. A lot of people didn't. They told you not to come back. And this time, if they find you, they might not be so nice. So now if we read verse 10, if I think of myself in that situation, then I feel like some meaning starts to come to the surface. Verse 10 of chapter 2, "It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. Now, if I would hear that, I think my ears would perk up a little bit. That Jesus was made perfect through sufferings, through experiencing some of what we're experiencing. Because out there, everybody tells me that I'm going the wrong direction. That the reason I'm suffering is because I'm going the wrong direction. And I kind of started to believe them, that I was on the wrong path. Because certainly if I'm following God, things shouldn't be this hard, right? But you're telling me that suffering is part of the way, that Jesus is ahead of us in this road of suffering, that Jesus has experienced suffering too. Well, I feel some encouragement that I'm not on the wrong road, but I'm actually going in the right direction, perhaps. Hebrews focuses a lot on suffering, so do many parts of the New Testament, because that was the experience of these congregations. They were suffering in a very real way. Well, as we go through verses 11 through 13, as far as I can tell, it's just a sense of telling people that we're all a part of the Jesus family. We're all together. Jesus is human like us, and we're all part of this family. As we move to verse 14 through 18, that's when we get this drama of salvation is laid out before us. I'm going to read through it again, and then we'll start talking about what's kind of underlying this understanding. And we'll use our handy-dandy little chart, too. So verse 14. Since, therefore, the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same thing. So Jesus is human like us. Okay? So that through death, he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. For it is clear that he did not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, he had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. Now, what the writer of Hebrews is doing here is holding two pieces together. On one side, he's holding incarnation together, which was a common understanding of the Roman time. Caesars proclaimed that the gods had sent them into the world to save it. And so likewise, we have an understanding of Jesus who's being sent into the world by God to save it. And then, now, the writer of Hebrews is combining this understanding with the history of Jewish temple practice, and specifically sacrifice. And animal sacrifice is underneath this. When we see that sacrifice of atonement, this is what's being referenced to. And Jesus is going to be, the meaning of Jesus is going to be framed in this way. And when we start talking about animal sacrifice, we just wonder what in the world is going on here. But there is a logic that's in this message, and I think it's important for us to try to understand that logic, for us to understand what's going on here. So, what's going on? If we just cover up our Jesus on the cross here, God creates the world, and sin and brokenness and death enter into the world. So that's all of our squiggly lines. That's my best representation of sin and death. And humanity is all caught up in it. We can't get ourselves out of this web, no matter what we do. Okay, we can't save ourselves. So God takes initiative to save humanity and bring reconciliation back to the world and to the people. And the first thing God does is to provide a way. Okay? The Ten Commandments. This is a new way of life that will lead people out of suffering and death.